This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. I recall a seminar some time ago I was involved in with my good friend Giovanni Arrighi, and we were talking about some of the processes that were going on around the world because Giovanni was very much concerned with how to understand the global structures of capital accumulation. And at some point or other, I recall saying, look, we're not only dealing with an accumulation of capital which is based on the exploitation of living labor in production in the way that Marx describes in Volume 1 in Capital in great detail, but we're also dealing with practices of accumulation which are really based upon dispossession. Now, when I talk about accumulation by dispossession, I'm really talking not so much about primitive accumulation, which forces people off the land, encloses the commons, leads to the creation of a wage labor force. What I'm talking about is the fact that accumulated wealth in some form or other is being appropriated and by certain sectors of capital, and there's a number of ways in which this is going on. And I would want to make the argument that the form of contemporary capitalism is heavily inflected towards accumulation by dispossession as opposed to accumulation through exploitation of living labor in production. Now, what do I mean by this? For example, Marx himself actually talks at a certain point in Capital about the way in which capital centralizes, in which big capital takes over small fish, as it were, gobbles them up and starts to expand its power and its mass simply by takeovers of more and more small capital. And Marx talks about all of this as being what he calls the laws of centralization of capital, in which increasingly within particular sectors, large capital takes over smaller capital till in the end you get a quasi-monopolistic situation of the large capitalist dominating all else. And we then see certain situations arising in which, as Marx says, the credit system becomes one of the major vehicles of centralization of capital. And it works in this kind of way, that if you cut the flow of liquidity to some sector of the economy, then there is a great difficulty in that sector of the economy of firms actually refinancing their debt. And if they can't refinance their debt, then essentially they get forced into bankruptcy. So that accumulation is no longer, as I've said, a result of production. It's a result of trading upon asset values. For example, if there is a part of town which is beginning to look like it's, going to go up in quality, we get the kind of the famous gentrification process in which you need to expel certain populations from the space. Now, how is that done? Well, there are a number of ways it can be done. Some of it legal, some of it illegal. And landlords, of course, have wonderful ways to try to get tenants out of their buildings. There are all kinds of strategies for doing that. Of course, in the 1970s, there was this strategy of burning down buildings, and the Bronx was burning, as it was said at the time. So these processes of eviction are actually becoming very, very significant in urban areas throughout the capitalist world. And as you evict populations, so at a certain point, the evicted populations have to go live somewhere. So this is a little bit like what Marx talked about in primitive accumulation on the land, except this is not happening to create wage labor. This is going on to try to liberate spaces so that capital can come in and rebuild in a certain area, re-gentrify, if you like, through a strategy of accumulation through urbanization. So when we look at something like this, again, it's accumulation by dispossession. People are dispossessed of their rights, of their access to good areas for the city to live in. They're forced out. They're forced out to live on the margins, where maybe they have long commutes to get to work and that. And so again and again and again, we'll see a kind of a sort of history of eviction, of an expulsions going on. We will see similar things going on back again upon the land. There is a process of what we call land grabbing, which is going on all over Africa and throughout Latin America as well, in which capital, looking for good places to invest, will say, look, the future lies upon control over land and the assets on the land, like raw materials and mineral resources and productive capacity of the land. And so big capital starts to move in and to speculate in land values. And speculating on land values, you find that land values start to be forced upwards and upwards and upwards to the point where actually value is now accumulating in the hands of the rentiers rather than in the hands of the direct producers. Accumulation by dispossession has always been there, has always been significant. It's never gone away. That since Marx was writing about the 17th and 18th century capital and the origins there, that actually it never stopped. It's always been there. But that since the 1970s in particular, we've had more and more accumulation shifting towards the question of dispossession rather than the creation of value through the employment of labor in production. And this then raises a kind of interesting kind of questions as to the nature of the capitalist society in which we currently exist. To what degree do we have to organize struggle against accumulation by dispossession? And of course, you will find anti-gentrification struggles. You will find struggles against the loss of pensions and the loss of healthcare rights and the loss of losses of that sort. We'll find struggles against land grabbing. But in exactly the same way that Marx talked about in the 17th and 18th century, how state power frequently is mobilized by the affluent classes to dispossess the rest of the population. So we see many forms of dispossession. So let me end, if you like, with one of the fantasies I have about the end of capital accumulation through class struggle. And it goes like this, that actually the nodal points within contemporary capitalism are very much the nodal points of logistics. And I have a fantasy that would say, if we organized all the airport workers in the world, and all the airport workers in the world suddenly decided not to show up to work one day, then capitalism would be stopped. It would be stopped dead in its tracks. There is a tremendous power which exists, which is that if the airports are no longer working, the system comes to an end. And we've seen some evidence of that. So there's the power, if you like. And some of that power can also be orchestrated around questions of rights to healthcare, rights to pensions, rights to social security, all of those questions which need to be kind of addressed. But they need those questions have to be backed by sufficient power within the system to be able to confront an economy which is based on accumulation by dispossession as much as it's based upon the exploitation of living labor in production. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.